In short, before we go to Jeff and more talk about the economy, let me say that if we are interested in exactly how does it play out on the Democratic side, I would never have guessed that it would be a problem with my bosses for me to come to Los Angeles today in late April. Today's April 18th, I believe. I thought for sure everything would be done.
It's the 17th today, isn't it? Yes.
Well, I had 17th, 18th, 19th through 20th. I thought it was going to be over for certain on the Democratic side. I thought there might be a possibility that the Republicans would still be nipping at each other. Had no idea that would be settled so early. And after last night's debate, I was just talking with Geoffrey. I said, I think that Senator Clinton looks like she's got Pennsylvania in hand. I'm not sure about the margin, but I think she'll win it. She'll stay in it. And then we go to North Carolina. I think Senator Obama, unless he has further slippage, has that in hand. And then we come to Indiana, and that's where I think you'll have some kind of determinative electoral outcome that would either have Senator Clinton go forward or leave the race. But the focus for the moment in terms of this dynamic, what will determine the outcome in a place like Indiana, is the argument that's taking place not so much for the 100 or so, I guess it's 151 delegates in Pennsylvania, 70-something in North Carolina. It's really for the 300 undecided superdelegates, and the key here is who can beat John McCain. Because if there's anything that's driving the thinking among the superdelegates, it's what is to me astonishing development that in head-to-head matchups in polls right now, John McCain is basically even or tied with either of the Democratic nominees. This is incredible because, as I indicated to you, there's such dissatisfaction with the 2 terms of the current Republican president, dissatisfaction with the war, and yet John McCain is somehow head-to-head with these Democrats. This is causing great concern among the superdelegates, and it could be the tipping point that forces the superdelegates to say they are uncomfortable with Barack Obama. That is the real backstory at the moment in the course of this election.
Geoffrey, let's turn to the economic issues. We have the Chinese currency now having appreciated, it's approaching 20% since 2005. We have our exports to China growing faster than to any other major export market. And yet a lot of people think that this is going to be a divisive issue in relations between China and the United States. What's your perspective on this?
Well, Stapleton, I think it is the big question in the economic relationship, but let me add one fact to US-China trade and then talk about the broader environment in which it's embedded. The fact is that despite the appreciation of the RMB, despite the health and safety scandals, despite declining demand in the United States, as you know, the US-China trade deficit in 2007 was yet another world record. This is the largest ever economic asymmetry in trade that the world has seen. So the trade deficit increased from $232 billion in 2006 to $252 in 2007. Now that conceals the good news, which is that US exports to China are growing more quickly than Chinese imports to the US. However, the sheer asymmetry in the denominator, it's a denominator problem, means that if you project it out, it's likely that the US-China trade deficit will continue to increase for the next several years. Okay, then I put on an economics hat, and the economists would tell us all blithely, well, it doesn't matter. Who cares about bilateral trade deficits? Who cares about trade deficits? There are pluses and minuses here, but don't concentrate on a bilateral trade deficit. I think that's naive and misguided on the part of economists because the political salience of this is incredible, it seems to me, potentially incredible. So here's the second thing I would say, which is a framing point. A remarkable thing happened in the US in the last 15 years, which is that support for globalization, which used to extend to all people with college degrees, now only extends to people with higher degrees, real white-collar professionals the last group left in the US who think globalization is unambiguously good for the US. I'd commend to everyone in the audience a piece in Foreign Affairs a couple of issues ago by Matt Slaughter and Ken Sheevy, who documented this. This sort of, that it's only people like us, frankly, the global elite, who continue to think that globalization is a great thing. It creates a bigger canvas for us all to paint on. The American middle class is hurting. We know this. The interesting thing to my mind, the interesting and most worrying thing, is that the American middle class was hurting and worried about globalization even while the US economy in aggregate was booming. So there's been this declining support for globalization in the US over the past 10 years or so in an environment when the aggregate economy was doing extremely well. So now put that in the context of a declining economy where the candidates are being asked, do something about the economy. And I think they know in their heart of hearts the US economy is something that they can't control. I mean, the Fed can't control it either, but certainly I don't think the candidates or the president can. They're asked to do something. They're asked to do something, and they're asked to feel the pain of the American middle class, particularly in swing states. You know, what do we know about why are these manufacturing, the 14 million manufacturing jobs in the US so important? It's because a hell of a lot of them are in swing states. You know, and getting to Indiana being after Pennsylvania being another example of that. So politicians can't do much about the economy, we know these days, they know that. The public is hurting and they want their politicians to do something. So what do? I think you acknowledge that the easy temptation for politicians is to say, we feel your pain and you're right, globalization is to blame. Now, this is where I'd actually give the Bush administration very high marks. I'd give high marks on policy towards China in particular, which essentially was to resist all the calls to do something rad, to beat on China. You know, you've got to appreciate the currency, 27.5%. Trade's unfair, we've got to impose tariffs. All that stuff the Bush administration resisted. I would give the Bush administration lower marks, however, for not being able to make the positive case. And it seems to me that the positive case with respect to China, which is the leading edge of this, is a difficult case to make. But the example I always use is the Apple iPod. Right? So an iPod shows up in the trade statistics as increasing the US-China trade deficit. Why? Because iPods are assembled in China and sent to the US. But Steve Jobs is a brilliant marketing guy. So you look at the back of an Apple iPod, and what does it say on the back of the Apple iPod? It says, designed in California, assembled in China. Right? It doesn't say made in China, the way we would have thought. And that is the reality of China's role in the global economy today. China is an assembly platform, at least, I think it's true that it's between 50 and 60% of Chinese exports to the whole world are just reassembling stuff made elsewhere. And more than half of Chinese exports are the exports of multinational firms operating in China. So you take the iPod example, and what you say is, boy, this is really great for the US because American ingenuity and a great American marketing combined with low cost, high quality, in this case, Chinese assembly, that's the global economy. But no one is, for whatever reason, no one is willing to make that case. The political debate is stuck with manufacturing jobs and trade deficits. And that's where I'd give the president lower marks because, as I said, I don't think President Bush has made the positive case as well as he might have. But in the current environment, we'd be really worried about the presidential candidates, particularly on the Democratic side, who have an even greater incentive to blame globalization. So I think 2008 is a difficult year, and it's not only a difficult year because of the political crucible in Washington, it seems to me it's a difficult year in US-China relations because of the political crucible in Beijing, which doesn't have much to do with transitions except the fact that the Olympics are taking place, and the bar on success of the Olympics that the Chinese elite has created is so high that, the likelihood that they can leap over their own bar is really low. So 2008 is a tough year. Globalization is getting a bad rap in the US. China's the leading edge of globalization. Temptation for Democratic candidates to engage in more China bashing, I think, is high. By God, we need leadership at the moment, it seems to me.